Hello, I'm John Larson Chudlik. We have a special guest with us today on this program called Deuteronomy. It's the law. And the law is important to us, each and every one of us. It was important in Jesus' time, and it's important today. And maybe the lack of what we call law, or the lawlessness today, is the reason that this country seems to be in some problem, some deleterious effects of not following that Mosaic Code, the law. We have with us today Michael Brown. Michael Brown is an author, he's a lecturer, a scholar, and also he's a legal entity. Michael Brown, tell us a little bit, what do we talk about when we talk about the respect of persons in regards to the law and the Mosaic Code? What is the respect of persons, Michael H. Brown?
Well, what they're trying to tell you in Deuteronomy 1, verses 16 and 17, and also in Leviticus 19, verse 15, is that you can't have two sets of rules in a legal system under God's laws. In other words, in our present system, we have a caste system, legal system. I mean, a lot of people are totally dissatisfied with the American system of jurisprudence, whether civil or criminal, state or federal, and the reason is that the way our legal system works is if your name is William Kennedy Smith or Neil Bush, all the protections of the law apply to you. But if your name is Rodney King or David Koresh or just some poor guy off the street that went to court and all of a sudden he realizes, wait a minute, this isn't fair, that's because we have a caste system legal system. In other words, our legal system...
Do you mean to tell me that I don't have the same rights as, shall we say, a Neil Bush or a William Kennedy Smith?
Well, you can watch the news any night and figure that one out. That's absolutely correct. What we have is we have a caste system legal system. Our legal system does not operate to administer justice. It operates to maintain the status quo. You go up in front of a judge, he's not there to deal out justice. He's there to maintain the control of all of us peasants and peons on behalf of the privileged elite that actually run this society.
Well, how did we get to this caste system that you say, Michael Brown?
Well, it's not a question of how we got to it. It's a question of how long have we been in it. What you're going to find is that a caste system legal system has been with us in one form or another since literally before the time of Moses. That's why it was prohibited in the Levitical and the Deuteronomic codes, which we now know as the Mosaic Code, everything from Genesis to the end of Deuteronomy. Every civilization, every nation that has had a caste system legal system as we have has eventually destroyed it. Would you like some historical examples?
I certainly would. Tell me about it.
All right. Let's start with the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Now, most historians will tell you the reason that William the Conqueror overran England is because the Saxon shield wall broke too soon, because the English were tired from a fight at Stamford Bridge they'd had weeks before, because the Normans had just invented that fantastic new war machine, the stirrup, so you could fight from horseback. And basically, that was all just horse manure, if you'll forgive the expression, because what actually happened, and any English history book will tell you this, is that the English had respect of persons in judgment. What had happened was Alfred the Great died in 900 AD. Let's
go back to the respecter of persons in judgment. Tell me, what does that mean again? So clarify in my mind about that.
It means there is one set of rules if your name is William Kennedy Smith or Neil Bush, if you're a member of the privileged elite in this society, and there is another set of rules for the great mass of us commoners. In other words, you and I are peasants in the eyes of the people who actually run this country, the politicians, the federal judges, people like that, the state judges, the people who actually run our society. This idea that we have a representative government is total nonsense.
Well, wait a second, but we have a Constitution, and don't I have the same rights under the Constitution as William Kennedy Smith or someone else?
Well, no, because the Constitution only applies if your name is William Kennedy Smith or Neil Bush. Let's get back to the Battle of Hastings, and you'll see how this works.
Okay.
All right. What happened is that when Alfred the Great died in 900 AD, he was a strong king. In fact, there's a legend that he hanged 44 of his own judges in a single day. My kind of a fella. Now, what happened was...
Be a record around here.
Well, maybe a record you're going to see is not going to be long and being broken. But what happened was England had a series of weak kings from that time up until 1066, and these weak kings allowed their judges... See, the problem with judges is you've got to keep a strong rein on them. If you don't maintain a death grip on your judiciary, pretty soon you have people getting out of line. Well, that's what happened in England, because whenever they had any type of legal urinating contest between the barons and the king's officers and the peasants always lost, because the judges always ruled in favor of the privileged elite. You can see that happening in American courtrooms today. So that by the time William the Conqueror landed, 80% of the English population had been reduced to serfs and slaves. They didn't look at this invader as an invader. They looked at him as a deliverer. The day of the actual Battle of Hastings on October 14th, 1066, the fact is William the Conqueror could have very easily been pushed back in the English Channel. Problem is, the English couldn't get any reinforcements because nobody cared. And see, that's what has happened all through history. I can cite you example after example. Let me just give you a couple.
And it all goes back to Deuteronomy 1:16 and 17, this respecter of persons, and people aren't treated equal, they aren't treated alike. You have an aristocracy that's treated better than the rest of the people. Was that it?
That's absolutely correct. That and Leviticus 19 verse 15. Now here's the irony. Here in the United States, every federal judge takes an oath that is a codification of that ancient statute. You'll find it at Title 28 of the United States Code, Section 453, where the judge not only promises to uphold the Constitution, but he also promises not to have respect of persons in judgment. Let me give you two more examples that we're very familiar with, one in this country and one from the 20th century. The first one in this country is our own war between the states, the Civil War. Now, there are all sorts of reasons that the South lost, but let me give you the real reason. What happened is that in the 18th century, when the cotton gin was invented, they had a labor problem. So instead of observing both those statutes and Isaiah 5 verse 8, which says, "Woe to those who lay house to house, who join field to field, there will be no place left in the midst of the land," instead of making sure there were jobs for the inhabitants, the native inhabitants of the United States, they went over to Africa and they brought slaves in, because slaves were cheaper. Now today we don't do that. We send the jobs out, we call it NAFTA, and doing stuff in Korea and that sort of thing. Well, what happened is there was so much of this that you had a few plantation owners who were literally running the entire 11 states of the Confederacy. I mean, most of the poor white boys that died in the war, they didn't have a share in it. What actually happened is that by the time the war began in 1861, the old Confederacy had 12 million inhabitants. But 4 million of them were black slaves. They had no vested interest in the status quo. So what you had, in effect, was you had a nation not of 12 million people, but of 8 million people, and 4 million who could have cared less. And that's why the old Confederacy lost the war between the states, because nobody cared about the guy on the bottom, black or white. Made no difference.
What about this? I heard about this Dred Scott decision. Did this fall in here someplace?
No, actually, that one didn't fall in there. What happened in the Dred Scott decision is Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. Now, up until that time, a slave that got across the Mason-Dixon line, he was pretty well home free. He didn't have to worry about it, because what you had was a scripture, Deuteronomy 23, verse 15. And what that scripture said was...
Deuteronomy 23:15
verse
says...
15. All right. Now, what that scripture said is that when a slave or a servant escaped from his master and he came to live with you, you couldn't return him. Well, what they did with the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 is they overrode that scripture. The fact is that just because something is constitutional doesn't make it a wise thing. In fact, there was in The Nation in 1952, Zachariah Chaffee said that something may be constitutional, but it still may be unwise. Well, what they did was a real exercise in unwisdom, because in 1857, in the Dred Scott decision, Dred Scott was a slave from Missouri who'd escaped into Illinois. And when he escaped into Illinois, he thought he was home free. Well, his master brought a suit in the civil courts, in the federal courts, got to the Supreme Court, and the 9 people on the Supreme Court, who all think themselves wiser than God even unto this day. I mean, the fact is that's one of our major problems, is our representatives, both elected and these characters nobody appointed, these federal judges, every single one of them thinks themselves wiser than God. Well, they thought themselves wiser than God then, so they said, no, Their legal reasoning was, let's just take Deuteronomy 23, verse 15, we'll throw that out, baby and bathwater together, and they used this legal reasoning that because the slave was property and no person can be deprived of his property without due process of law, he had to be returned. And 4 years later, it wasn't the primary cause, but it was one of the major causes of the war between the states. And 600,000 dead later, both sides, I think, kind of got the message. They should have paid attention to Deuteronomy 23, verse 15 to begin with.
So, in other words, what you're saying, Michael H. Brown, is the fact that they followed, say, the Constitution, they followed man's law, and if they would have followed God's law, we may not have had the Civil War to begin with.
The odds are that we wouldn't have, because, see, any time that you don't have some kind of pressure relief valve for people who are basically being shafted in one fashion or another, whether it's slavery, bankruptcy, whatever, people have a tendency to get violent. And this has also happened all through history. Well, that's how the war between the states, or one of the reasons. It's not the primary reason. You know, we can get into economy and usury and all that sort of thing. But the idea that you had a privileged society in the Old South is what lost the war. In other words, the fact is, if everybody had been treated equally, there's no possible way those Union armies could have come into the South and flattened it the way they did, which is that's the same thing that happened in this century with the Bolshevik Revolution. Everybody thinks, oh, you only had 300 people from New York's Lower East Side that went into Moscow and Leningrad and places like that and overthrew the Russian government. Well, the fact is, the Russian government had overthrown itself, because to begin with, in 1914, the Russian army was 5 million men strong. The Tsar had been begged by his cousin, the Kaiser of Germany, don't mobilize your army, you won't be able to turn them back. Well, he did. Millions of people in Russia were killed because of it, because of the Tsar's stupidity, because he didn't care about the people on the bottom, so that by the time the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar's government in 1917, most of the people in Russia could have cared less who was in charge. They were just spectators as far as they were concerned. If these people from New York's Lower East Side and these people in the Russian parliament wanted to fight it out, so what? A pox on both their houses. And see, we're rapidly nearing that in this society, because what's happening is as more and more people begin to realize that our entire nation, our entire society is run for the benefit of just a handful of people, what you're going to find is that eventually this government is going to come down either by fed-up citizens or foreign armies. That's the only thing that can happen.
People have to learn, I guess, maybe that this freedom, this thing that they call freedom, this republic is one ball of wax. Is that what you're saying, that everybody is entitled to their fair share?
Well, absolutely, and it's not just that they're entitled to their fair share. And see, you have to be careful when you start defining fair share, because what it says is, both in Deuteronomy and in the federal Constitution, the 14th Amendment, what it says is respect of persons in judgment, equal protection of the laws. It doesn't say that you can go out there and work 12 hours a day and bust your butt, and that somebody who's come along and just been lounging around gets a share of what you got. That's not what it says. What it says is, in the courts of justice, you are to be treated equally. And that's what everyone's lost sight of. And the fact is, what happens is, in our so-called courts of justice, like the great comedian Lenny Bruce once said, the reason they call it the halls of justice is because the only justice you find is in the halls.
Okay. We go from the legal system and the caste system and the courts of justice, where you only find this justice, they call it, in the halls too. What about this Baal worship? Is this a form of Baal worship? And what about this antinomian controversy that they talked about? Because I want to ask you, Michael Brown, is it just that you can abort a child? And let's get into that phase of what we're talking about as far as the law, biblical law, and what Deuteronomy says about children.
Well, what you have to understand is that we have a government that is literally at war with us. Like Mao Zedong once said, politics is war without bloodshed, war is politics with bloodshed. And we have a government at war with us, and the way they have done it, it's been very clever. All warfare is based on deception. That's according to Sun Tzu, The Art of War, a book written in China 2,500 years ago by a Chinese general. Let's take this abortion thing one step at a time, because this also goes to address the root problem.
Michael, this is going to be a little bit of, we're going to wait for just a second. We're going to get back to this because this is going to take us several minutes. And we're going to take it one step at a time. But first, the first step, let's go to a break first, and then we'll be right back with Michael H. Brown, author, lecturer, and legal researcher. If you are somebody who really believes in God's Word and wants to obey God's laws, you should have the Bible the Puritans used, with margin notes by John Calvin and John Knox and other leaders of the Reformation. Come back to the faith of our fathers. To order a free catalog, call 1-800-466-7959, extension 1143. You'll be glad you did. We're with Michael H. Brown, and Michael is talking about something, probably the most controversial subject, one of them of the day, and that certainly happens to be the abortion issue. And we're talking about Baal worship and abortion and the antinomian controversy. So fill us in a little bit, Michael. How can you equate Baal worship with, shall we say, abortion? Tell us about that.
Well, you don't equate it. It's the same thing. Let me explain how they arrived at this nonsense. In the first place, scripturally, the idea that life begins at birth is a heathen, not a Christian one. You can prove that in Job chapter 3, verse 3. What it says is quite plain. It says, "Cursed is the night a man-child is conceived." It does not say, "Shame on the afternoon, a piece of meat glued itself to a uterus wall." And what the Supreme Court actually did in Roe versus Wade, now keep in mind who these 9 people are. They weren't elected by anybody. They're all political appointees. None of them achieved that position through scholarship or integrity or anything else. That's the political spoil system we have.
You mean the
country.
Supreme Court, even getting up to the Supreme Court, it's just a spoil system? It's not because of the fact that you have a special genius for the law?
Well, as those 9 people prove on a regular basis, you can be clinically insane and still achieve a position on the Supreme Court. Let me prove it to you. What they did in Roe versus Wade is they used the philosophy of the Stoics to come up with this idea that life begins at birth. Now, the Stoics were an ancient Greek sect. They went out of business about 2,500 years ago.
Apparently, unfortunately, some of their ideas still remain today.
Well, no, it's a little deeper than that, because if you go to an encyclopedia set, you'll find the Stoics were followers of the Greek god Zeus. It wasn't a philosophy, it was a religion. And Zeus was known to the Romans as Jupiter Olympus. But to the Hebrews and in your Old Testament, he's known as Baal or Baal. In other words, what the Supreme Court actually did, and they slipped it past everybody for over 20 years, is they actually decreed Baal worship or Baal worship as the official religion of the United States. And that's one of the reasons we have problems. Now, but it goes deeper than that. In addition to the fact that, number one, you've got 9 people, or actually it were 5. Now here's the really ridiculous part of this whole thing. The Democrats have adopted this idea of abortion on demand as part of what they're standing for. But in the first place, Harry Blackmun, who authored that opinion, was appointed by Richard Nixon. He's a Republican. And when Roe versus Wade was upheld in 1992 in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, Casey was the Democratic, and still is a Democratic governor of Pennsylvania who's pro-life. He's the one that Clinton wouldn't even invite to his inauguration or anything else. He's basically a Democratic pariah. There were 9 Supreme Court justices when that case was decided again, one of whom was a Democrat, Byron White. He voted against it in '73. He voted against it in '92. The 5 Republican justices who voted for that, 3 of them had been appointed by Reagan and Bush, who were supposedly pro-life. Remember, all warfare is based on deception. The fact is, our privileged elite are in a war with us. Now, once they did that, they created some other problems, not the least of which is about to come home to roost on us in the next war, is that what they did was count 18 years and 9 months forward from Roe versus Wade. We are missing 2,000 18-year-old adult males from the draft pool every single day of the week. In other words, we had, for a while there, 4,000 abortions a day. Now it's up to 4,500. Where do you think we got our troops from in this country in every war we fought? We didn't get them from the upper class, the privileged elite. Fat yuppies don't fight wars. Poor kids fight wars because sometimes that's the only place they can get something to eat. I know that from experience. I was 17 years old in Arkansas when I went into the Army to get something to eat.
Now, Michael Brown, you're telling about me. Michael H. Brown, you're telling me that we're at war now. Is that true? Is this correct? Could we be at war in our own country?
That is correct. Remember what I said earlier? Politics is war without bloodshed. See, what's happened is the common people in this country have been the victim of a war waged against them by their own government, their own privileged elite. You don't believe that one. Look at what happened in Waco last year. I mean, that one, they took the gloves off.
I want to ask you about this because there's a lot of preachers that I talk to. Matter of fact, one of the preachers that I go to and said, well, David Koresh and those people, they're cultists. But I said, how can you condone the fact that this government, the FBI and the BATF and the CIA, because they all had a hand in it, how do you condone the fact that they went to Waco and killed those women and little children and those other men and David Koresh? How do the preachers of this country condone that fact?
Well, what they've missed in that entire operation is the reason Koresh and Company had to be put out of business was not because they were cultists or not because they might have been doing something sinful. I mean, if the ATF was after guns, why didn't they go after the Bloods and the Crips? Were they afraid of getting hurt? In other words, there are places in this country right now where no police officer will venture into because the gangs control them. But the ATF did not have the intestinal fortitude to go after people who are really dangerous. They were just down there shooting a media event. There were some other problems there too. What our government was doing there, now remember, they had no business out there in the first place. Here's what was wrong with Waco. Okay, in the first place, the ATF was out there for a media event. They could have picked him up any time they wanted. The guy used to go jogging in the morning. But more seriously than that, number two, the warrant, I saw the search warrant that was issued. It's called a rummage warrant. It's like the old British writs of assistance. Here's a piece of paper that says I can search your house. You look at it and says, what are you looking for? And they said, whatever we can find to incriminate you. Well, that was the British writs of assistance. That's one of the things we fought our Revolutionary War over from 1776 to 1781. The federal magistrate who issued that warrants should have been taken out and shot himself. Number three, when the ATF went out there, they were trying to enforce laws that Congress never had the authority to enact in the first place. You cannot use one clause of the Constitution to enact a gun law, which is what they've done. Article 1, Clause 8, Section 3, the Interstate Commerce Clause. You can't use that to override the Second Amendment. The Supreme Court made a ruling the very same year this gun nonsense was passed in 1968, saying exactly what I'm telling you. It's in a case called Williams versus Rhodes, 89th volume, Supreme Court Reporter, page 5. And it was an election case, but it said exactly the same thing. You cannot use one clause of the Constitution to override another clause. Here we have a government agency, the ATF, or BATF, whatever you want to call these characters, whose primary function, 90% of what they do, is designed to trampling the Second Amendment. Now, there's a good reason for that. If you read von Clausewitz on war, after you get through killing people, and they've been very successful at that, we got 30 million dead children that somebody's going to have to answer
from the abortion you're talking about, the 2,000 a day from 19...
No, 4,000 a day. I'm not even counting the women. I'm only counting the ones that are available for the draft pool.
Oh.
So, you know, Napoleon had something to say about that we'll get to in a second. But what you had here was a situation, and you have an agency that their sole function is to disarm us. Now, as von Clausewitz said on war, one of the primary functions that you have in a war is to disarm your enemy. If we are not the enemy of the federal government and the privileged elite, why are they trying to disarm us? What are they afraid of? I mean, you don't worry about your friends shooting you, you worry about your enemies. That's what's happening.
Let me kind of grasp this, if I could,
Sure.
Michael Brown, because what you're saying almost is that the United States government, we're talking about the criminal justice system, the BATF and the CIA and the FBI and so forth, they are at war with the citizens on one front, and on the other front you have the Supreme Court that is war against the babies, the children, because we've lost 30 million people to this Baal system of worship, which we call abortion?
Well, you can't call it, you can't compartmentalize it. The fact is the government, the federal government, for the most part, is acting as a unit against us. And it's like Adolf Hitler once said. I know a lot of people think he was a very nasty person. Well, he was predictable, because when you treat people the way people got treated in Germany from the time of the armistice in 1918 up until the Weimar Republic ended in 1933, you're going to get your Hitlers. And the reason that you do is because when you have a bankrupt country, which we have, I mean, these idiots running this operation have basically squandered money all over the world. All right, they're going to raise taxes, you know, our taxes, yours and mine, to pay for it. When you have a bankrupt country goes into receivership. And the receiver of a bankrupt country is called a military dictator, whether it's Adolf Hitler, Napoleon Bonaparte, or who knows who or what we're going to get next. The government is actually acting as a unit, and the reason they're acting as a unit is the people currently running the government have installed an alien religion. And as Hitler said, you can't make war against the power of the state. You must become the state. See, our people have basically been remiss in not running for public office, for allowing all these congressmen and these federal judges. Federal judiciary is the biggest problem we have in this country today.
But what about the people? I mean, I know a lot of good people, and they should be running for office, but they say, oh, it's too dirty for me. I mean, those politicians are too dirty. How do we get control of this government and get it back if so many people just think it's too dirty and they're not willing to step in a pile of manure?
Well, you know, if you don't want to work in a cesspool, you should never apply for a job as a plumber. And that's what you're doing when you're running for political office these days. You're saying, hey, I want to go into the cesspool and I want to see if I can clean some of this garbage up.
Because if we don't do it, if somebody doesn't do it, then what we're going to do is be the residue of the cesspool forever. Is that?
No, what will happen is, as Napoleon once said, dictatorship always follows anarchy. We're very close to anarchy right now in this country. People can't walk the streets. It's not safe. And the only difference is that it's not safe for one person at a time. You can still take 40 armed men out. You can walk through any neighborhood in the United States. You'll be perfectly safe. Eventually, even that won't be true. What our congressmen are going to have to do is, we have a federal judiciary that has been literally responsible to no one. Thomas Jefferson had some real choice quotes about those people, the sappers and miners working underground, concerning our confederated fabric and our republic and our Constitution. Thomas Jefferson started criticizing the federal judiciary in 1804. He was fairly consistent. Now, the reason that the federal judiciary has gotten so far out of line, including those idiots on the Supreme Court who instituted Baal worship as the official religion of the United States, is because the only time that Congress ever disciplines a federal judge through an impeachment proceeding is either for income tax fudging or taking a bribe. The last time a United States federal judge was impeached, tried, and convicted for trampling the rights of an American citizen was the trial and impeachment and conviction of federal judge John Pickering on March the 12th, 1804. In other words, see, the average American citizen is under the mistaken impression that he votes for somebody and that person represents him and everyone lives happily ever after, but you notice they keep throwing these bums out. Well, the reason they keep throwing these bums out is because no matter how corrupt the congressman is, the odds are he'd be a hero if just every once in a while he'd take one of these corrupt federal judges, and there's nothing more corrupt than a federal judge, and scraped him off the bench. And if they would just do that once in a while, the fact is, the average guy, you go up to your congressman, and here's a guy that, like in my area of Kentucky, 7th District of Missouri, the congressman there is responsible for 568,000 people. Well, there's not a whole lot you can do for 568,000 people, except if you have a federal judge there, like in our area, we have Russell G. Clark. Now, this is the maniac who brought up a forced busing program for Kansas City, Missouri. Now, forced busing is ridiculous, because if you really want to have equal education, bus the teachers. They have their own cars. It doesn't cost the taxpayers anything. All right?
I haven't thought of it that way. That's a pretty good analogy. Yes, I like that one.
Now, what Clark did by implementing this plan in Kansas City, Missouri, which was the feature of a recent 60 Minutes broadcast showing it was a dismal failure, this one federal judge, I mean, this character who thinks himself wiser than God, pays no attention to his oath of office or anything else, cost the taxpayers of Missouri $1.2 billion. Now, the English used to have a cure for that. If you stole more than you could pay back, or you mismanaged more than you could pay back, they just take you out and hang you. That's why regicide was always a hanging offense, because before the Norman Conquest, you killed a Welsh horseman, it cost you 200 shillings, you ponied up the money, you got away with it. You could walk away. Obviously, you couldn't do that every day. You killed a king, it cost more money than they had in the empire, so they just took you out and hanged you. Figured, you couldn't pay it back. Well, what we have is, we have literally hundreds of Russell Clarks. The American people are not ruled, they are not governed, they are not administered by their elected representatives. They're ruled by federal judges elected by no one. And what's happened is, because these federal judges have been undisciplined. In other words, I don't care how badly you trample someone's constitutional rights in the United States, what's going to wind up happening is you're going to go in front of some federal judge, and the only time that they will actually say, no, wait a minute, this is wrong, we're going to take care of this, we're going to apply constitutional law to it. You can run a computer search on this, Lexis or Westlaw, and here's what you'll find. You will never, ever, not any time in the 20th century, especially after World War II, find a federal judge at the district court level or at the appellate court level saying, well, we can't hold still for this. This is an American citizen and he has rights and we're not going to allow that. That's not what they say. What they say is, we have to clean this up to maintain public confidence in the judiciary. In other words, it's a big shell game. And they have to, every once in a while, they have to throw us peasants a fish so that that most people will maintain public confidence in the judiciary. Fact is, if the average American citizen knew what the federal judiciary had done to him, had done to his country, had done to his country's future, it's not just the military issue. As far as the abortion issue goes, there are a lot of other issues. Who's going to pay into Social Security? Chinese tried this nonsense for a while, and it didn't take them too long to snap to the fact that if they maintained this one couple, one child program by the year 2000 for every single human they had in the workforce, they would have 6 retired people. That wasn't going to work. Your farmers are getting hurt. There are 30 million people out there not consuming agricultural products. And eventually, there will be 30 million people not buying cars, not buying clothing, not buying anything else. The fact is, if you really think...
What is the retribution for the 30 million? What do you think the retribution for this country is from God's law for the 30 million abortions that we've permitted through the Supreme Court in this country, Michael Brown?
I believe you'll find that in Exodus 21, verse 23. It's quite plain. It says, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, wound for wound, stripe for stripe, life for life. The fact is, under God's laws, under Deuteronomy, it's the law. Fact is, it's God's law that those 30 million unborn that have been slaughtered because of the Supreme Court nonsense, and let me tell you how they arrive at these decisions. It's like Walter or William Brennan. I get the guy who played on Lassie and the guy on the Supreme Court mixed up all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the one on Lassie was a lot more intelligent.
That's William Brennan.
Yeah, but yeah. William Brennan, the Supreme Court justice, what he said was, with 5 votes, you can do anything. In other words, the Constitution is meaningless in the hands of these maniacs, and we're going to pay for it, because under God's law, what's going to wind up happening is, if that law is still in effect, and I believe it is, and I believe everyone else is going to learn how much it's in effect when it comes time to pay the piper, we're going to have 30 million of our citizens slaughtered because of it. And it might even get worse than that. Not only do you have that scripture in Deuteronomy, but you can go to the book of Amos. I believe it's chapter 5, verse 3. And God's saying, look, if you don't obey my laws, here's what's going to happen. You're going to have 100 people in a town, and 10 of them are going to come out of it. And you're going to have 1,000 people in a town, and 100 are going to survive. In other words, God Almighty himself, I think, has just about had it with us. And I think what's going to wind up happening is, if we don't shape up and start obeying his laws, he's going to kill 90% of us. I think he's pretty well had it, just like Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah, he killed more than 90%. He just wasted 2 whole towns, and I think it was like 3 people managed to get out alive. In other words, after a while, I think he loses his sense of humor.
I guess you're absolutely correct. Now, we've talked about the abortion issue. We've talked to the relationship of the abortion and the. You call it Baal. Is that how you pronounce the?
You can
Baal
pronounce
worship?
it either way. I believe in English you can pronounce it Baal or Baal worship. The Hebrew pronunciation is actually spelled B-A-A-L, and it can be pronounced Baal or Baal. The fact is nobody really knows, because Hebrew's been a dead language for 2,500 years. So nobody really knows the exact correct pronunciation. You can wing it, and I don't think anybody will figure it out.
Well, in Deuteronomy, it's the law. We're talking basically where Deuteronomy, where Moses said that basically, I mean, it's retribution or restitution. Is that pretty much what Deuteronomy has to do with also, Michael?
Well, what it has to do with is Deuteronomy actually means second telling, and it covers all of God's laws from Genesis all the way up to Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and you'll basically find a duplication. In other words, if you could only take one book out of the Bible to live by, that would be the book to take, because it not only covers what we're talking about, respect of persons in judgment, it also covers sanitary laws, it covers laws of marriage and divorce, it covers laws for agriculture. In other words, it covers all of God's laws to make life relatively simple for those of us who aren't trying to enslave our fellow man. In fact, I'm glad you brought that up, because we need to bring up a couple of other points here, and I hate to keep harping on the abortion issue, but there are a couple of other things that need to be said on that. The first is, I wanted to use a quote by Napoleon. Napoleon, who was one of the greatest generals of all time. Fact is he can run circles around Bill Clinton, who's now the commander-in-chief of our armed forces.
Well, is there anybody that can't run
Well, no, I'm
around?
talking about Napoleon was one of the greatest generals the world has ever seen. Mm-hmm. And one of the things he understood is you had to have troops. I mean, people talk about push-button warfare and all that, but they're always fought in the mud. I mean, everybody develops a counterforce or technology to deal with the technology that's being used against them, and so forth and so on. But Napoleon used to go to these fancy balls, and he'd go around, he'd interview the women, and he'd go up to them and say, "And how many children do you have?" And if the woman said 2 or 4 or whatever, he'd make some compliment, and sometimes it was a little off color or whatever. But if a woman said she didn't have any, he'd look right at her in front of everyone else and say, "Then why don't you go home and have some?" Mm-hmm. And I think we're going to rapidly get to that point. The other couple of items I wanted to address refer to constitutional law. See, under the Fifth Amendment, it says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property. Well, our Constitution was written in the language of the English common law. And under the common law, person was from time of conception, not from time of birth. What the Supreme Court also did in Roe v.
So from
Wade,
common law and from Job, it was
correct.
time of
Conception.
conception.
That's correct.
All right.
And so what the Supreme Court actually did in Roe v. Wade is they took the Fifth Amendment, which everybody at the time of its enactment understood that the meaning was that from the time of conception, that was a person who could not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and the Supreme Court rewrote it so they could force Baal worship or Baal worship down our throats on the rest of us. In other words, you can take constitutional law, and the fact is, it's relatively meaningless. I call the Bill of Rights, or the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, I call them the list of suggestions, because in the hands of today's federal judges, that's all they are. They're suggestions. They don't mean anything.
Can you believe that? A list of suggestions for our Bill of Rights? I am amazed, Michael Brown, and I am just not going to go along with it. I'll tell you that, because we have to straighten this out. Now, you wrote a book also, and regarding the law, and regarding the Bible, and also regarding so many different aspects and facets of the law. And tell us a little bit, in this book, and we're going to talk about it a little bit later, but tell us about jury trial and the grand jury. What does this have to do with, say, Deuteronomy, it's the law, and where do we have the jury trial and the grand jury? Tell us a little bit about that also.
Well, we're right back to respect of persons in judgment, because the fact is that jury trial, as the framers intended, hasn't existed in this century. See, if you read the Sixth Amendment carefully, it supposedly guarantees trial by an impartial jury. But in every federal and state criminal trial these days, the first thing the judge does before the jury is sequestered to come in with a verdict, he turns to the jury and he says, "You are here to judge the facts. You must obey the laws I give it to you." That's a lie. Because impartial jury meant, and everyone in this nation understood this for half a century after the Bill of Rights was enacted, that impartial jury meant the jury had not only the right to determine the facts, but they had the absolute right to determine if the law was horsepucky or not. In other words, it was a goofy law, they didn't have to enforce it. People today enforce these laws after being lied to by these judges, and then they hang their heads in shame when they give a verdict because they don't know any better. It's called jury nullification. The reason it doesn't work is because it's unscriptural. Fact is juries are basically unworkable, they're unscriptural, they'll never work for this reason.
Why are they? Yeah, I want to know why they're unscriptural.
Well, in the first place, in biblical times, they used what was called the Great Sanhedrin. It had 23 members, the same as our modern federal grand jury. It's where our modern federal grand jury came from. The Great Sanhedrin had two presiding officers. They had 23 priests, 23 scribes, 23 elders, 71, which is the number of books you should have in a Bible. Ibn Khaldun pointed that out in 1377. In other words, the judges of Israel were 71, every one of whom not only was trained in the law, but took a solemn oath to protect the rights of the accused. Now, see, judges today don't do that. Most judges today act like prosecutors. You know, it used to be you had a prosecutor, a defense attorney, and a judge. Now you've got 3 prosecutors. That's the way it works in all federal courts these days. Your own attorney basically is going to try to sell you out. The reason a jury system doesn't work is, number one, it's unscriptural. Where the jury system originated was in 1215 AD. Innocent III said he was tired of this trial by ordeal nonsense because, I mean, it was basically superstitious and ridiculous, and innocent people were getting hurt.
Was that the old walking across the hot coals?
Oh, hot coals, cold water, you know, hot iron, whatever. All sorts of ridiculous, I mean, stuff we look at today.
It would be ridiculous to me if I had to
you look at it today.
Show my innocence by walking across those hot coals.
Well, see, today we look at that and say how stupid and primitive those people were. Well, those were the same people that gave us the jury system. Because what happened was this, is the king said, well, okay, we can't have a trial by ordeal, we're going to have to do something else. So he just turned it over to the judges and said, do whatever you feel like. Go on whim or suspicion. So the judges did. Well, they started getting a lot of bad press real quick. Fact is, they started making a lot of enemies. So the judges themselves came up with this idea of putting 12 common people in a box, none of whom had the slightest idea of how a legal system was supposed to work, or how evidence was supposed to work, or how to tell what was just and unjust, and who was lying and who wasn't. And the people who had to undergo trial, the jury trial business actually started about 1219. And the people at the time who had watched trial by ordeal, they understood immediately that trial by jury was just another form of ordeal. It was just less predictable. And by the 15th century, the people in England were so fed up with jury trials because jurors were packed, bribed, intimidated. Fact is, let me give you an example.
Oh, you couldn't do that, could you?
Oh, sure. Let's take the John Gotti trial. Okay, now that's one that everybody knows. This was public knowledge. 2 jurors came forward at the end of that trial, and they said, we wouldn't have voted guilty, except we were told that if we didn't, the federal government would retaliate against our families. Now, you want to talk about intimidated?
Are you really telling me that this is the truth? The federal government itself would go tell jurors that, I mean, would they intimidate them that way, that there would be problems with the family?
No, that's not the way it works, because the only person who could have told them that was another juror. Now, that's called the Judas trick. That's in chapter 1 of my book, the Erwin Rommel School of Law, because I look at a court case not as a quest for justice, but as a military operation. Courtroom is a battlefield, law is a weapon, judge is your enemy, and the odds are your own lawyer is an enemy spy. Now, once you understand when you go into an American courtroom that you're surrounded by enemies, that judge is not up there to administer justice. Again, he's there to maintain the status quo, even if he has to twist and bend the law to do it. Roy Kahn had a very good saying about that. What he said was, I don't care what the law is, I only want to know who the judge is.
He doesn't care about the law, he wants to know who the judge is.
That's correct. Roy M. Kahn said that in 1988, and it's the most accurate saying of the American legal system, because that's exactly the way it works. See, and what you have to, when you go into a federal court or a state court on a civil or criminal case, and right now we're talking about criminal, the jury system, you have to understand that the judge is there to tamper with the jury. But it goes deeper than that.
Well, before we get too deep into this, Michael Brown, and I want to talk about that Judas trick.
Please.
But we'll be right back with the Judas trick after we talk about your book, and that was the Erwin Rommel School of Law. Brown's Lawsuit Cookbook, How to Sue and Win. Michael H. Brown, the author, has been successfully fighting civil and criminal cases in both federal and state courts for over 20 years. To order this free catalog for Brown's Lawsuit Cookbook, just call 1-800-466-7959, extension 1143. You'll be glad you did. Hi, I'm John Larson Schudlick, and we're back with Michael H. Brown. He's a legal researcher, he's an author, a lecturer, and we were talking just recently about the Judas trick. And we all know about Judas, but apparently there's a Judas trick as far as the jury or the grand jury or the trial juries are concerned. And we were talking about one individual by the name of John Gotti. Let's go to John Gotti because most people know his name, and then also one Manuel Noriega. But let's start with John Gotti and this Judas trick. Tell us a little bit more about this, Michael Brown.
All right. Well, see, in the John Gotti trial, the Judas trick was actually put out in front of the public, but they didn't recognize it. Because when those two jurors came forward and said, we were told that if we didn't vote guilty, the federal government would retaliate against our families, that wasn't anything as crude or unsophisticated as a United States attorney go to them and say, hey, you turkeys, if you don't vote this guy guilty, we're going to come after you. We're going to give you the, the Waco.
We're going to break your knees, or we're going to take the tank and roll over your house.
Nothing as crude as that. No, they've got this thing refined to a science, and if people on the juries don't recognize it, what happens is when they all come in to vote guilty and half of them hang their heads in shame, they don't realize here's what actually happens. There's a 1928 Washington, D.C. case that the Supreme Court later overruled that says that anybody, and this was true under the English common law, this is what was meant by impartial jury, the Supreme Court doing constitutional tampering again, like Jefferson was fond of saying. Anybody who was a master, servant, or relative of one of the parties to the litigation could not serve on the jury. Well, if it's United States versus John Gotti, and you've got three people from the Postal Service there, who are they the servants of? Who are they employed by? They're employed by the United States, the plaintiff, versus the defendant. So here's the way they work it. What actually happens is, let's say you got some poor guy who works for the Postal Service, and his life's miserable to begin with, all right? But he's got to keep his job so he can support his family and send his kids to school.
He's got 3 years before he gets his pension.
Bingo. Now, so what happens is, United States attorney or one of his assistant United States attorneys, and if you want to talk about people that are just as corrupt as the federal judiciary, we're talking about the United States Attorney's Office, Janet Reno on down, and this was even worse under the Bush administration. But what happens is one of these members of the United States Attorney's Office goes to the guy's supervisor at work and says, look, this John Gotti trial, we really need this conviction. The government really needs this conviction. This guy's gotten away from us twice. He's really dangerous. He's killed people. He just didn't do it 86 at a time like Reno and company. And we really need this conviction. So the supervisor, not realizing that what he's about to do is a felony, goes to the guy that's been picked for jury duty, that's down there throwing the mail bags, and says, hey, look, John, this Gotti trial, the government really needs a conviction. And so here's poor, John Schmurd down in the mail room, heaving these bags, and he's thinking, my God, if this guy doesn't get convicted, I'm toast. I'm going to have more problems here in this government operation than I've got already. So when he gets into the jury, the only thing he's got in his mind is, he doesn't care what the evidence is. He doesn't care what the rules are. He doesn't care how many government agents have committed perjury, which they do all the time. It's, standard operating procedure in the federal courts these days, because no federal agent is ever indicted for perjury. It never happens. They're above the law. So this guy goes into the jury room, and all he's got in his mind is, if he doesn't hammer these other 11 people into a guilty verdict, he's going to lose his job. He's going to lose his pension. He's going to get crap from his supervisor. So his whole thrust in there is, hey, look, this guy's really dangerous. He's really, I realize some of the evidence was questionable. The government agents may have lied a couple times, but on balance, we really need to convict these guys. So
and he wouldn't be here unless he was guilty, right?
Oh, absolutely. The government wouldn't, our wonderful government would not have indicted this evil person, whether it's John Gotti or some guy they just scraped off the street down in San Antonio, Texas. Our government would not have done this if this person was not really a horrendous, horrible person who should be put away. Now, the mistakes in the Gotti trial were legion, but that's what happens in every single federal and state criminal trial in the United States. That's how they get 94 to 97% convictions.
But wait a second, wait a second. What about the people that think we're just a little bit, goofy because of the fact the government has treated them all right all these years, and the government couldn't be this misguided, this misinformed, and this corrupt? What do you tell people like that?
Well, just like I had a guy from Canada stop by my house one day. He said, "Brian," he said, "why aren't you out there trying to wake everybody up?" I said, "What for?" He says, "Well, it's your duty." I said, "Oh, really?" And he said, "Well, yeah." I said, "I've spent 10 years trying to wake people up as to what's going on." I said, "Does anybody really care?" He said, "No." I said, "Look," I said, "let me explain how it's going to come down." I said, "We've disobeyed God's laws. We don't love our neighbor as ourselves." I mean, that's the first thing somebody in a jury box should be thinking is, love thy neighbor as thyself. I mean, this poor guy in the dock, the only thing he's got going for him is maybe one Christian who lives by that on the jury who can offset the Judas that the government's already put in there. Because here's what's going to happen. God Almighty's only going to put up with this disobedience for so long, and then we're going to pay the penalty. You're either going to have foreign armies from Asia coming across the Bering Strait. You're going to have plague. You're going to have all sorts of really unpleasant happenings that you'll read about in Leviticus 26, starting at verse 14. In other words, at some point, we're going to have to pay for all this, or God in that book has been lying to us for just literally thousands of years.
And my God doesn't lie.
Well, then you're in for some really interesting times, because there is no way that this society, being managed the way it is going to continue the way it has been continuing for the last decade or three. It's just not going to happen. In other words, at some point, what's going to wind up happening is we're going to be punished for our national sins. In other words, sin isn't something that somebody necessarily does individually. It can be done as a nation. You can go all through the Old Testament. Judges 6, the time of Gideon, everybody said, "Oh God, we're being really mistreated by these Midianites. Send us a deliverer." So Gideon shows up, knocks down the statue of Baal, and everybody gets all upset. They want to kill him, because the first thing that'll happen is when God sends us a Gideon, all these idiots we've got in this society, and there are a lot of intelligent people, but unfortunately we've got a lot of morons too. All the morons are going to say, "Oh, how awful." Give you a case in point. Let's say somebody went up there with 10 of his father's servants and knocked down the Statue of Liberty. Now, most of the people in this country would think that was just awful. But in the first place, that's a graven image. In the second place, that female in the harbor is a statue of Baal's wife, the goddess Ashtaroth. And if you don't believe that one, go to any encyclopedia set that has a statue of the Colossus of Rhodes, built exactly the same way. Headdress representing the sun's rays, copper covering an iron framework, 121 feet from toe to crown, holding an upraised torch. The Colossus of Rhodes was a statue of Baal. It stood over the largest harbor of the ancient world.
So, with Deuteronomy, it's the law. We're talking about God's law in relationship to man's law. And we're talking about this Baal worship in regards to worship of our own God. You say in your book that law is war. Explain that to us. When we talked about the fact that we're in war now, but explain about this basic training that we have, and as far as the law is concerned, and why we are at war, and what is war, and how can we overcome?
Well, here's the way you have to overcome it. In the first place, basic training, that's covered in my Brown's Lawsuit Cookbook, which you have a copy of there. But you have to understand, in this society, there are actually 3 sets of rules or laws. There are God's laws, which nobody has paid any attention to for generations, and we're about to come a cropper on that one. There are man's laws, your constitutional law, statute law, case law enacted by judges, which is what I teach people how to weave in and out of, because most of the time they don't have a clue as to how it's supposed to operate. And then there's what's socially acceptable. In other words, if you're going to be politically correct, you have to have a certain set of attitudes that the major media and the government wants you to have. Now, the reason I say the major media and the government is because people think that we have three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. That's not true. We have 6 branches.
Oh, well, come on. I know that there's 3. There is just, like you said, the legislative, the judicial, and the executive. What can be the other 3?
The other 3 are the major media. They're simply the propaganda arm of the federal government. The multinational corporations. Why do you think NAFTA passed? As Thomas Jefferson once said, a merchant has no country. His loyalty is to from where he derives his profits. That's why NAFTA passed. And the bureaucracies. And where I learned this from, when I realized this, I thought, wow, this was a book called 200 Years of American Constitutionalism. It was written by 2 lawyers, one of whom had graduated from Yale. The difference was these 2 lawyers who knew more about our constitutional system and what was wrong with our system. These 2 lawyers live in Moscow. They're Russians. They're commies. You know, I mean, there's people that we were taught for years were the enemy, and they've looked at our system and dissected it and said, hey, you know, these people in the United States really don't have a clue as to how their own system works. But that's where I learned that we had 6 branches of government. And if you think about it, look at ABC, CBS, and NBC. Have you ever noticed that none of those major media networks ever disagree with each other on the nightly news? In other words, if David Koresh was a cultist or anything like that.
Yeah, why didn't they go have him? Why didn't they ask him if he wanted to be on ABC or NBC or CBS or CNN and present his view? They wouldn't do that.
Well, the problem was they had too many FBI and ATF agents in the road. See, the fact is, if Bill Clinton had been any kind of a man, what he should have done is he should have pulled all those federal law enforcement agents, because see, here's where people mistake law enforcement. People think of FBI, ATF, DEA, and that as police, they're here to protect us.
That's what I thought. That's when I was growing up.
No,
I wanted to be an FBI agent at one time.
Shame on you. No, every government law enforcement agent, and unfortunately this goes for a lot of big city police forces, they are not there to protect us. They are there to subjugate us. They are to keep all of us peasants in line. And let me give you an example here. We have a prison system. Now, the prison system supposedly is to protect us from criminals. But have you ever noticed there's more crime every day, and they build more prisons, and then there's more crime? In other words, people running the government have got this attitude, apparently, that if it doesn't work, well, let's just try a little more of it, and eventually maybe it will work. That's nonsense. Under God's laws, if somebody commits rape, murder, or kidnapping, you hang him, you stone him, you put him to death, and you're quick about it. If he steals something, if he's caught with it in his hand, he pays back double. If he's already eaten it or consumed it, he pays back 5 times. And if he goes in front of a judge, and we're talking about one of God's judges, not these idiots we've got today, and the judge says, okay, are you going to pay back the 5 sheep for the one you just stole and ate? And the guy says, no, I'm not going to do anything like that. The judge says, okay, fine. They take him out and hang him. The problem is our prison system is not run to protect the public. It's run to protect the incomes of the prison administrators and the judges and the lawyers who feed off of it. Because our prison system, the fact is, the crime gets worse every day, and we build more prisons, and crime gets even worse. What's that tell you? It tells you something isn't working.
Well, as Cicero said, the more laws, the less justice. Thank you, Michael Brown, for being with us on Deuteronomy. It's the law. John Morrison Schudlick, and this program is called Deuteronomy. It's the law. I'm here today with Michael H. Brown. And Michael, we're talking about the law and the revelation of the correlation of the law itself, God's biblical law, to the legal system of today. Let's take a look at, say, first of all, our prison system. It's my understanding with the prison system, the criminal justice system, that we have prisons so we can punish people, we can protect society, and we can rehabilitate the prisoners. Is this true?
No, that's merely the rhetoric. It's not the reality. In reality, the people punished are the taxpayers, the families of the prisoners. Nobody is rehabilitated for a very good reason, which we can cover here directly. And as far as protecting society, you'll notice the higher the crime rate goes, the more prisons they build, and then the crime rate goes even higher. And it's like the government has this attitude, and this is federal and state governments, that if you pour gasoline on a fire, you can put it out. And it simply doesn't work. The problem with the whole prison system, it's scripturally incorrect.
Well, you say it's scripturally incorrect. Michael Brown, tell me, why is it scripturally incorrect?
Well, under God's laws, which, and as I've stated before, the representatives that we elect all think themselves wiser than God, and they think that they can come up with solutions outside of the Mosaic Code, outside of Deuteronomy and the other books of the law in the Bible, to make life easy for society, and it simply doesn't work that way. Under God's laws, rape, murder, kidnapping was a death penalty, and they were very quick about it. If you stole something, you paid back 2 to 5 times. If you developed an attitude and said, well, I'm not going to pay that back, they just took you out and hanged you. The crime rate was infinitesimal compared to what we have now. Fact is that when you don't make punishment swift and certain, then the hearts of the sons of Adam are set in them to do wrong. And that's what we have in this society today. We have a completely unscriptural, and if it's unscriptural, the synonym for that under God's laws is it's unworkable. We have a completely unscriptural, unworkable system that gets worse every day. People are screaming about crime. Even organizations like the National Rifle Association, who should know better, are screaming for more prisons. What they ought to understand is that one of these days they might find themselves on the inside looking out.
Yeah. It's interesting because now they have this new crime bill up in Washington, like $22 billion. And they claim that it's going to be $89,000 for each law enforcement officer, except for the fact that $89,000 for each law enforcement officer, that doesn't include the salary that has to be paid by the local community, whether it's the government or the county or the city. Tell me, who's making money off this law enforcement, this crime problem?
Well, you see, you hit the nail on the head there, because the reason we have this prison system and the reason it keeps expanding is because all businesses depend on repeat customers, and they depend on expansion. In other words, a business will either expand or contract. It will not remain stagnant, and the prison business is just that. It's a business. What you have is you have a situation in this country in which the only people who actually benefit from the prison system sure isn't the prisoners, and it's not society, are judges, lawyers, prison administrators, and people who supply all of the above. The fact is, it's like a self-contained racket, and the sooner the public wakes up and realizes that the hangman's noose is a lot cheaper than keeping Jeffrey Dahmer alive for 40 years and feeding him, the sooner that happens, the sooner the crime rate will begin to go down.
Michael, you're probably right, because I can remember in Florida they had a fellow by the name of Ted Bundy, and he had killed many, many women, and yet it took them 12 years before they finally prosecuted him. Is that the way that this society is, that the lawyers have to get their part of it before we really have true justice?
Well, actually, we didn't have true justice there, because what happens in this day and age is even when somebody is executed for capital offenses like Ted Bundy did, it takes years and years and years to give
millions and millions and millions.
Precisely, to give him something that should have taken 30 days or less and a length of rope and a hole in the ground, which is very economical. That's God's law. This man's law of going through all this endless nonsense of appeals and counter appeals and habeas corpuses and that, when there's no doubt as to the man's guilt, what they ought to do is if they just take him out and hang him and make it swift and certain, you simply would not have the problems that we have today. And I know there are a lot of people say, well, capital punishment doesn't prevent crime. Well, the way they administer it in this country, that's true. I mean, a guy figures, well, sure, I get caught and I'll get to lay up for 10 or 15 years before I get executed, and I might even beat it then. That's no deterrent.
What about these people like John Gracie and whatever? Is there a kind of a type, a character of people that are mass murderers?
Yes, and this is going to be politically incorrect as far as the statement I'm about to make, but it's scripturally
but we're
correct.
Spiritually correct here, aren't we?
Right, all right. Now, under God's law, and you'll find this all through Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, what you'll find is that the type of people you're describing, John Wayne Gacy in Chicago, the fellow who murdered the 26 little boys and stuffed them in the sand down in Galveston, Texas, Jeffrey Dahmer, the trash bag murders in California, almost any time that you have a mass murderer or a serial killer, you're dealing with a sexual deviant, you're dealing with a homosexual. Under God's laws, you don't integrate homosexuals into the military or anywhere else. You execute them.
Or on the police forces of this country.
Well, that's kind of ridiculous, because when you and I went to breakfast yesterday morning, the Denver headlines were Denver police force to recruit gay police. Well, while we're at it, why don't we start a vice squad and stuff it with child molesters? And for property, why don't we go out and recruit burglars? In other words, you start putting a police force full of people who are totally amoral. And see, this is one of the reasons. It's not just because of the disgusting, filthy habits these people have, but anyone who's been around large numbers of homosexuals, one of the first things that you recognize after you watch them closely is these people are totally amoral. They have no conception of right and wrong. They only have a conception of what they can get away with and what they can't. And that's why God says, take them out and string them up. I'd like to qualify that. That doesn't include lesbians. That's a different story. But male homosexuals, under God's laws, Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, when a man copulates with a man in the fashion of the woman, he shall surely die. That's exactly what they're saying.
Now, we're talking about the prison system, Michael Brown, and we have this problem supposedly of prison overcrowding in this country. And it seems to me that the judges say, well, you know, we can't keep the people in jail, so we'll put the people out on the street. We're talking about maybe the advanced criminals or the felony type of criminals. Should we allow them to go back and on the street, the majority of people criminals behind bars?
Well, you're going to have to at some time or other, because the fact is the taxpayers can't afford to keep feeding all these people forever. And the other thing is, there is such a thing as an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth and a life for a life. And some of these people that got busted with, say, a nickel bag of marijuana or something like that, you bury them alive for 5 or 10 or 20 years or whatever. That's patently ridiculous. What you're doing is, in a lot of these cases of overcrowding, you've got people sleeping next to urinals. I mean, you've got some really explosive situations. You're packing people in like rats. They're going to turn violent. So yes, they have to be turned loose. 90% of the people in the prisons and jails today, you could turn them loose tomorrow and the crime rate wouldn't go up an inch, because they're harmless. They're in there for writing bad checks, they're in there for nickel-dime dope dealing, they're in there for shoplifting a sweater, for nonsense like that. Fewer than 10% of the people locked up in this country are really dangerous. But here's what actually happens. When a federal judge issues an order to relieve prison overcrowding, and I don't have any problem with that, because you simply cannot treat people like animals. I don't care who they are. In other words, if they're bad enough, don't treat them like an animal, execute them. But don't treat them like an animal, because you're just going to make you more dangerous. And so this happens, if you'll notice in the newspapers all over the United States, anytime a large number of prisoners hits the street, the next thing you know, normally within 2 to 6 weeks, there's some horrendous crime or crimes. There's been another rape, another murder, another kidnapping. And the prison administrators wring their hands and say, oh, this is awful. We told you we needed more money for more prisons. And look what's happened because we had to turn these people loose. You know, you've got to give us for more money for more prisons, which means we can hire more prison bureaucrats and we can expand this business. What they don't tell you is this, and you can observe it. Nobody has to take my word for this. Just read your daily newspapers and you'll see this happens every single time. What actually happens is the prison administrators, whose very incomes, whose very livelihood depend on this satanic slave market that our prison system actually consists of, what these people do is they'll sit down and they'll have a list of all the prisoners and what they were convicted of. And they will not turn loose all the first-time bad check writers or the first-time dope dealers or anything like that. They'll go down through the list and they will deliberately turn loose people they know are extremely dangerous. Because for...
Now, how can you say that, Michael Brown? Are you telling me that this system is so absolutely corrupt that they want more crime so they themselves can benefit from it?
You've just made a mild understatement. Yeah, you catch on quick. Unfortunately, the public doesn't catch on, because what happens is that once they have turned these people loose, see, for example, a rapist, now under God's laws, the reason a rapist is executed, there are two reasons. In the first place, he can't be rehabilitated. In other words, you can't have an attitude adjustment, you can't send him to a psychologist, no mind-altering drugs are going to straighten him out. In other words, he's going to do it again. No ifs, ands, or buts as soon as he gets the chance. Now, not only that, he destroys the life of the woman that he does this to. What actually happens is they sit down there and they take a look at what these people are going to do or what they've done. Rapists are totally predictable. In other words, if they've done it once, they're going to do it again when they get the chance. So here they've got, let's say a prison official has to turn 1,500 people loose. Now the problem is if he's only got 3,000 people to begin with, those are his customers. Those are his reasons for getting his salary, for getting appropriations, for getting promotions and all that. If you turn 1,500 of these people loose and you've rehabilitated them, in other words, they'll never come back, according to the way the prison administrators look at it, if the system works, it fails. Because here's what happens. In order to maintain a...
Wait a second.
Yeah.
You mean, is this what they're talking about, the revolving door? They want some of those people to come back?
Well...
Or they know that they're going to come back, some of them?
Any business depends on repeat customers. If you have an 80% recidivism rate, then you're competitive with the normal business out there. You're going to have repeat customers. If you don't have that recidivism rate, let's take it down to 1,000 people. Say we've got 1,000 men in a prison. We've got 200 prison administrators and guards and various hangers-on and bureaucratic camp followers and that sort of thing. If you actually rehabilitate 500 of these men, you teach them a trade. Fact is, most people are in prison not because they're criminally inclined, it's because they're stupid. In other words, they just, or they're untrained or they're unskilled, and it was all they could do.
Or the country sent their jobs NAFTA overseas or something.
Well, that's true. The fact is, the average guy in prison is not a career criminal. He's just normally some guy that can't compete. Now, let's say you took these same individuals and you put them through a training program. You actually did rehabilitate them. See, no prison will do that for this reason. Let's say you've got these 1,000 men and you sent 500 of them to a machine shop school, where when they came out they were journeyman machinists and had good jobs and so forth and so on, wouldn't need to steal or deal dope or whatever. Now we're down to 500 men in this prison. Now, if we're down to 500 men in this prison, what do we need with 200 prison guards? Now we only need 100, which means that the warden, the captains, the lieutenants, half these guys, and what I call people who run prisons are uniformed welfare recipients, because all they do is they stand around and supposedly keep order. Most of the time they do a very poor job of that. So now you have all these uniformed welfare recipients that have to go out and get in a real welfare line, and whoever the politicians are that are responsible for this nonsense, they lose votes over it. That's all there is to it.
Well, okay, let's equate it then. Let's finalize this in the next minute or so, this portion of it. The law according to Scripture and the law as far as our legal system in the next 45 seconds.
Well, it's like I said at the beginning, our entire prison system is scripturally incorrect, and whenever you have something that's scripturally incorrect, it is unworkable, and nobody benefits by it except the handful of people who administer it and the judges and lawyers who feed off of it. Fact is a guy will sell everything he's got to stay out of 20 years in prison. If you just took him out and took a horsewhip to him and smacked him 20 times and sent him home, it would still be a deterrent, but no lawyer could feed off him or his family or his relatives or the system or anything else.
Are you telling me then that when a government system doesn't work, that they just want more of it?
That's correct. If it's prisons, gun control, whatever it is, whatever doesn't work, the people in Congress now, they seem to think that, well, if it doesn't work, we just need some more of it, and then maybe it'll work, which is total nonsense. Again, it's like throwing gasoline on a fire. Let's put out a fire by throwing gasoline on it. It's a liquid. It'll probably work.
This is Deuteronomy, It's the Law. We're with Michael H. Brown. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Brown's Lawsuit Cookbook, How to Sue and Win. Michael H. Brown, the author, has been successfully fighting civil and criminal cases in both federal and state courts for over 20 years. To order this free catalog for Brown's Lawsuit Cookbook, just call 1-800 466-7959, extension 1143. You'll be glad you did. All right, this is Deuteronomy. It's the law, and we're talking with Michael H. Brown. Michael, we're talking about the prison system, and we just finished. We interacted a little bit about what prison system really is and the comparison of that prison system with what God's law would have as far as the Scripture. And remember, we're the ones that are, you are anyway, you're scripturally correct versus being politically correct. So let's go to that political aspect of the legal system and the grand jury. Tell me a little bit about the grand jury and how does that fit in with today's prison system and criminal justice system?
Well, in order to get customers for a business, you have to have a way of bringing them in. And for that, you use the grand jury. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a legitimate grand jury indictment in the United States for generations.
What is that? A legitimate grand jury indictment? Explain that to me.
Well, the Fifth Amendment supposedly guarantees indictment by grand jury. Grand jury has two functions. The first function is that of investigation. They are supposed to make an investigation independently of the prosecutor, the judge, the FBI, the DEA, or anything else. Their true function is they're supposed to investigate the investigators. That doesn't happen. The grand juries today have literally been reduced to a rubber stamp since the time of the Nixon administration. Their second function is that they have to act as a shield between the accused and the awesome power of the federal government or the state that has grand jury indictments. Like New York, for example, has grand jury indictments. A lot of states proceed by what's called a prosecutor's information, which we don't need to get into here at the moment. But everyone who serves on a grand jury these days has completely abrogated his responsibility for the reason he's not told what his job is. No one goes in front of a federal judge these days, and the federal judge, as a federal judge did down in North Carolina in 1875, what this particular judge told the grand jury, and it's one of the published cases from the 19th century, back when they were still doing it right, he said, "You cannot acquit yourselves of your solemn responsibility by slight or careless investigation." And one of the other things he said, which nobody even thinks about these days, is what you people need to do when you go into that grand jury room, you need to look at this law that this poor guy has been indicted for and ask yourselves, did Congress have the right to enact this nonsense in the first place? If the grand jurors today were...
Wait a second. Okay. Hold on, Michael Brown. Are you telling me that if I'm a member of a jury...
Grand jury.
A grand jury. Not only am I supposed to reach a verdict correctly, but I'm supposed to determine what the law should have been in the first place?
That is correct. What you're supposed to do is you're supposed to compare Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 1 through 17, 8 being the enabling clause, powers herein granted to Congress, which you'll find like number 1 is taxes, 3 is interstate commerce, 15 is military, so forth and so on. And what you're supposed to do as a member of the grand jury is you are not only supposed to make an investigation of the investigators, you are not only supposed to say, wait a minute, do we want to put this guy on trial? In other words, you have a responsibility to be something more than a rubber stamp. But you are also supposed to look at the law itself. And if you know how to read constitutional law, which doesn't take a whole lot of effort, in other words, all you have to do is have enough intelligence to be able to go to Article 1, Section 8, and read the 18 clauses there. And if the law you're dealing with does not fit within one of those clauses, Congress never had the right to enact that law in the first place, and the grand jury is supposed to vote a no bill. Now, wait a minute, we're not going to make...
Are they told often, I mean, the grand jury personnel, the jury members, are they told often what they're supposed to do?
No, I don't believe there is a single record in any federal court case going back for about 25 years, and I've seen literally hundreds of them. I've seen grand jury transcripts. I've seen court cases. I mean, I've spent just literally 20 years at this. I have yet to come across a grand jury case from the last 35 years in which it was conducted properly as the framers of the Constitution intended.
Michael Brown, that means there's a lot of people in jail right now that probably shouldn't be there because of the fact that they didn't take their solemn responsibility as far as the grand jury system, or at least they were not told about that responsibility. Could that be accurate?
That's absolutely correct. There's a 1926 Supreme Court case called Albrecht versus United States. And in this case, the Supreme Court pointed out that a court can acquire no jurisdiction to try a person unless he has been indicted or unless the court has acquired jurisdiction in a manner prescribed by law. Now, the grand jury laws are fairly simple. There is a series of checks that can be used to see if, in fact, the grand jury proceeding was conducted properly. One of which is they're supposed to have a roll call at the beginning of the proceedings. They're supposed to call out and make sure that at least 16 and up to 23, no more, no less, members of the grand jury are there before the proceedings start. Now, I've been through hundreds of grand jury transcripts. I have yet to see that, but it has to be there because under the Court Reporters Act, anytime you have a criminal federal case, you've got to have a record of absolutely everything that took place, which includes the roll call of the people who should have been there. Most of your grand jury transcripts today, when you look at the beginning, it just says, and the grand jury was convened at such and such a time. There is no record whatsoever of whether there was one person in that room or 100, or the prosecutor was just in there amusing himself. You can't tell. Since the Nixon administration, and as you may notice, I'm not very fond of Republicans, since the Nixon administration, they have taken this shorthand method of dealing with the constitutional rights of American citizens, and they've literally been running people through these things like cookie cutters. Number one, you have to have a roll call. Now, when you indict someone, and you'll find everything I'm telling you, it's public record. It's part of the American or the federal criminal procedure rules, which you'll find in Title 18, United States Code. Go to Rule 6. Everything I'm telling you is right there in Rule 6. When you indict someone, you have to have 12 people who vote to indict him. Now, the way the modern federal courts do it is the grand jury foreman turns to the people on the grand jury after they've heard the evidence, which is mostly normally one government cop up there reciting what was already on the indictment that was prepared by the prosecutor. Indictments are supposed to be prepared after an investigation, not before. And he'll say, well, okay, we've got all these people here. How many of you people vote to indict this guy? And he'll count the raised hands, and he'll write the number down, and then he'll sign his name to it. That's not indictment by grand jury. Under a legitimate, proper grand jury indictment, which you will find in Rule 6b-2, you have to have 12 qualified members voting that indictment. You can't have some guy that just got off the boat from Turkey who doesn't speak English and is not an American citizen raising his hand in that room just because he saw everyone else did. There are some other qualifications also. In order to determine who those 12 people are, you have to have a ballot, and those people have to have signed that ballot. It's also called a concurrence form. In 20 years and the hundreds of grand jury transcripts that I've reviewed, I haven't seen one, not one single one, in which 12 people actually wrote their names, yeah, we're voting this indictment, so that someone could come along later and compare the 12 names of the people who voted the indictment to their qualifications, because if one person wasn't qualified, the indictment is no good.
Well, we're talking with Michael Brown, and Michael Brown, of course, is a legal researcher, he's an author, he's a lecturer, and he wrote a book that we're going to be going into right now. It's called it's called the Brown's Lawsuit Cookbook, and let me just show it to you. It's Brown's Lawsuit Cookbook, How to Sue and Win, with Michael Brown. And one of the subjects in there, one of the chapters talks about basic training. Tell me just a little bit, Michael, about what this basic training is about, and then let's go to the common law after that.
Well, actually, the entire book is basic training, because it starts right off showing you that we're not governed by elected representatives, we're governed by lawyers in judges' robes. We used to have 3 branches of government. In fact, I wrote that book 14 years ago. It's still valid. In that book, I pointed out our 3 branches are now lawyers, lawyers, and lawyers. And they control all 3 branches. What that book does, it's...
Should you ever vote for a lawyer?
I wouldn't. Unfortunately, the problem is, if you vote for somebody who isn't a lawyer, who's just a power-mad jerk, he'll do an even worse job. So unless someone is familiar with the Mosaic Code, you're back to square one. You're going to get 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. In either case, if you get someone who thinks himself wiser than God, who's got a law degree from Yale, or if you get some jerk that fell off the turnip truck, New York has a lot of these. They call them town court judges. They're completely unfamiliar with the legal system. In either case, you're going to get a shafting. If you don't have someone just men who fear God in the judicial bench, you're going to have a legal system that's a disaster, which is exactly what we have. And the primary reason I wrote that book was to show people that this whole legal mumbo-jumbo business, it's an indexing system. You can go to the public library. If you can use the Dewey Decimal System, you can use the legal indexing system. And that's what that book is. It starts off simply showing you, here's how you draft a lawsuit. Here's how you file it. Here's what you do next. Here's how the system really works. Who made the rules. It shows you how to go into any law library. You can take that book into any law library, whether it's in a county courthouse or in a university, and simply after spending a day or two reading that book, you can do almost anything as far as basic research that any attorney can do. It's simply an indexing system.
Well, Michael, I think that would mean probably that regardless whether you hired an attorney or not, if you purchased that book, if you read through the book, did some studying on that book, that you would be much further ahead. I mean, it could probably save you tens or thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars.
I've had people tell me exactly that over the last 14 years. I've had people that have got, in fact, I have a friend up in Iowa who's really gotten good. He bought that book from me 14 years ago, and he's won 5 out of 6 cases so far. And I asked him why he lost the 6th one. He says, I got cocky.
Well, tell me, we're going for Brown's Lawsuit Cookbook, and you talk about the common law in this How to Sue and Win cookbook. Tell us a little bit about the common law and the Constitution, if you would, Michael Brown.
Well, the common law, I don't address in this book. I address it in the sequel, the Erwin Rommel School of Law. But I think it's something that needs to be addressed because a lot of these patriot groups, and a good friend of mine has an expression, he calls it patriot mythology. It's like my grandmother used to say, it's not what you don't know that hurts you, it's what you know that ain't so. And a lot of people in the patriot movement and all these other places, they think that the common law is something that came from God, just like the Bible, and they think the same thing of the Constitution, and they're mistaken on both counts. The common law simply means that in 1187, Henry II was fed up with people going from one county in England to another. I believe they call them shires or something like that. And as soon as you crossed the county line, you ran into a whole new different set of rules, and you got locked up because...
We didn't get the word shyster from there, did we?
No, I don't think so. I think that's from something else. And, anyway, Henry II was really tired of people being reamed by the legal profession because they didn't have a common set of laws to all of England. So he told one of his judges, Ranulph de Glanville, he said, look, I'm tired of this. He said, I want one set of laws that are common to all of England. So de Glanville sat down, did the best he could. He thought there's no way he could harmonize all this nonsense. So since de Glanville was also a Latin scholar, he grabbed the 12 tablets from the old pagan Roman Empire. And if you want to know where a judge's robe comes from, those black robes that judges wear in our so-called American Christian courts today, they're from the old pagan Roman Empire. And it's like I tell people, the reason that I hate judges so much is, I mean, how much respect can you have for someone who's sitting above the high water mark in a courtroom wearing a Halloween costume from 2,000 years ago? I mean, how much respect can you have for someone like that?
I haven't thought it that way before, but I think I will in the future.
Well, I've thought about them like that for years. And what happened is after de Glanville handed Henry II this book, it was a fairly short book, saying, and he plugged in the 12 tables of the Roman Empire, and he plugged in a few statutes and things like that. And from 1187 on, now most of these laws were not based on Scripture, the English simply kept adding laws and adding laws and adding laws. And then about the 17th century, they actually started using judicial decisions as precedents to interpret the laws, so that by 1789, when our Constitution was adopted, and now some states they go from 1607, the 4th year of James I, for the common law, but we just adopted the common law in toto from the English. The law is common to all of England. And now the way you use that in a court proceeding is, in the absence of statute, you go according to the common law. For example, if you have a statute that says something that can be interpreted either way, and you can go back to the time of Edward III, let's say in 1342, that's when they first came up with the idea of the strict construction of criminal statutes. If a criminal statute was going to be interpreted one way or the other, you had to interpret it in favor of the criminal defendant. And if you go all the way back for centuries and you find something that the statute can be read either way, and you find something from the English common law, say from the 14th century, then you can bring it into court, and what the judge is supposed to do, say, well, all right, here's the statute. It can be interpreted this way or that way, but since you brought in the ancient, some ancient statute from 1342, and this other fellow brought in nothing except some kind of logical argument, you win. In other words, that's what the common law is used for. Now, as I mentioned earlier in our first tape, the American Constitution was written in the language of the English common law. In other words, if you have a doubt as to a constitutional provision, as to what it really meant, not as to what some Supreme Court idiot, has said it meant from week to week, because if you'll notice, the Supreme Court kind of reverses and waffles and skids back and forth, I think between 1939 and 1947.
The Supreme Court, let's go back.
Yeah.
Do they act on law or do they act on policy today, Mike?
No. The United States Supreme Court does not make legal decisions. They make political decisions, and then they use law to buttress it. It's like we mentioned earlier, Justice Brennan said that with 5 votes you can do anything. In other words, the Constitution means whatever 5 of these idiots say it means, whereas anyone who is at all familiar with legal scholarship or constitutional law would understand that if you wanted to find out what the Constitution meant, you would go back and read the debates of that era and look at the law of that time and say, okay, like impartial jury, which we had already discussed, meant the jury decided the law and the facts. But the Supreme Court gerrymandered that. In other words, in fact, there's a case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey, in which, if you read the case carefully, this is a 1992 Supreme Court case, the United States Supreme Court actually gives themselves the right to amend the Constitution. Their words are, well, the United States Supreme Court is the only body able to make needed changes. In other words, if the Constitution needs changing, these non-elected idiots are the ones that are going to make it.
And they can't do it.
They do it every day. Now, see, it's a question of jurisdiction.
Is law power then? Do they have?
Well, no. Law is not power. It's what's behind the law. It's like a lot of the people in the Patriot movement get in this business of, well, I'm a sovereign citizen. I don't need a driver's license. Court doesn't have jurisdiction. The way I explain jurisdiction to somebody, you and I go to a convenience store, and each one of us is there after a six-pack, and you bring out your money, you bring out your ID, you bring out your driver's license.
But neither one of us drink. So.
Well, I understand. I'm using that as a sake of argument. Okay, you're right. We don't drink, smoke, or eat white sugar. Now, I'm just using that for the sake of argument because this is where I have to put all these people in this Patriot mythology program down so they'll understand jurisdiction. Now, when the two of us walk in this convenience store and you've just laid out all your paperwork, you're copacetic. I pull out a .44 Magnum. And it's loaded, and I've got it pointed right at the cashier. My question is, which one of us has jurisdiction? That's the way our legal system works. The fact is that the only reason that the people in the government do the things that they do is because right now they've got all the troops and heavy equipment. If that ever turns over, they're going to have some real problems. In other words, if God ever sends us a Gideon to deliver us from these Midianites that govern us, I think you're going to find there are a lot of people whose legal arguments aren't going to hold water because there will be no guns and tanks to back them up.